I'm going to walk through a complete cam swap that even a beginner could follow, broken down into 4 stages. I'll show you how to upgrade the stock valve springs, then replace the camshaft, the stock chain and chain tensioner. I'm going to show how to upgrade the rocker trunnion bearings, and finally how to prime the engine with oil. Make sure you watch till the end to get all the tips and tricks of how to do a full cam swap.
While the engine's out, I've decided to add a bit more power to my stock LS3. I'm going to install this aftermarket camshaft, which should take the output to over 500 brake horsepower when installed in my GD427. The kit was supplied by Gardner Douglas, and it's a camshaft that they use in their own engine upgrades. It should offer a good increase in power and torque, but also with a good balance of drivability and emissions. And as a bonus, they can provide a baseline ECU map for this cam profile. Let the fun begin.
The items I'll be changing include this ComCams camshaft, these Lingenfelter double valve springs and titanium retainers, and this 3-bolt camshaft sprocket and dog bone style chain damper. This was a new crate engine that I sourced through Gardner Douglas. Now, I have actually started it a few times. I wanted to see how it sounded when I first got it, but other than that, all I've done is change for these nicer Holly rocker covers and fuel rails. I'm going to kick off the process by swapping out the valve springs first. So I start by removing the coil packs, and I've already removed the spark plugs to make it easy to turn the engine over. And next are the 4 valve cover bolts. And that releases the valve cover, which can be moved away, giving access to the rockers, springs, push rods and valve stems. Now the rocker bolts can be removed. I only want to remove the rockers of the springs that aren't under compression at the moment. It's the 2nd and 5th rockers from the left that are putting the springs under tension. So I manually turn the engine crank until those springs are released. Now those remaining 2 rocker bolts can come off. With all the bolts removed, the rockers and the tray can come off as a set. All the push rods can come out. And now we're almost ready to start replacing some springs. So I'm going to be using the TDC method, so ideally you'd be doing this in some planned order. I'm starting here with cylinder number 8. Here's the spring compression tool that I made. This is what happens when you have a box of steel offcuts and a TIG welder and very little patience for an order to arrive. The tool bolts down into the 2 rocker bolt threads for each cylinder. This piece of steel plate has been profiled to sit snugly on the spring retaining caps. I'll add some grease to the M10 threads. And now I can securely compress those springs. The intake valve is a bit stuck. I tried to use a magnet to see if that would release it. No, that doesn't work. The valve locks on the exhaust side come off just fine. Just going to try a slight turn with the spanner to see if that helps release it. And yep, that's done it. And out come those valve locks. I pull the valve up with a magnet, but it drops straight back down again. It doesn't drop that far in because the cylinder is at or near top dead center. So now we can remove all the tension from the springs. The springs and the retaining caps can be removed. Gently try to persuade the valve seals to remove using needle nose pliers. I'm trying to be extra careful here. I don't want to damage the valve stems, of course, but I also would like to keep the seals in case I need them again. I've dipped the new valve seals in oil to make them easier to seat. While I've been concentrating on putting the valve seals on properly, I didn't notice that I'd forgotten the spring seats. Oh well, I'll notice this in a few seconds. Okay, so it's finally dawned on me that I'm missing something. So out come the seals again, and this time I'll put the spring seats in first. I push those valve seats down as far as they will go with my hands first, and then finish off with the correct size socket and a light hammer. The new double springs can now sit on the spring seats. Now for the titanium spring retainers. Now we need to compress the new springs to install the new valve locks. It's important that the springs compress coaxially to the valve stems, leaving an equal space around the stem for the valve locks. This will allow the valve locks to be installed more easily. A valve lock is made up of two valve lock halves, and they both need to sit in the correct position until the spring compression is released. So pull the valve stem up as high as it will go with the magnet, and you will now see me somewhat clumsily install a valve lock. I found the trick here is to add a little bit of grease to the valve lock, letting it stick to the underside of the valve stem. That's one of the halves in position. And in goes the second half. That's the intake done, now we're ready for the exhaust side. With the valve locks installed for both sides, I can now remove the spring compression. I have to compress and uncompress the tool a few times to let the lock seat properly, but we'll get there in the end. And that's the installation of the new springs for cylinder number 8 complete. The next cylinder in the firing order on this side of the bank is cylinder number 2. However, I seem to have misread my notes and actually started on cylinder number 4. So I'm going to do a small adjustment right now just to bring those valves to the top. Ideally, I would have done each cylinder in firing order. So on this side of the bank, it would have been 8, 2, 6, 4, turning the engine crank manually 90 degrees after each one. But really it doesn't make too much difference as long as the valves don't drop too far in. Here's a clearer view of the valve locks being installed. That's the springs for cylinder number 4 complete, and we move on to cylinder number 2. And then onto the last remaining cylinder, which is cylinder number 6. As you can see, I'm working exclusively on the right hand bank of the engine. The springs have already been changed on the left hand bank. And that's it, that's all the springs upgraded, ready for the new camshaft to go in. The camshaft swap begins by removing the serpentine belt, remove the 6 water pump bolts, the water pump and the gaskets can now come out. So next up I need to remove the harmonic balancer or crankshaft pulley, and to prevent it rotating I slot a bolt in an exposed hole in the flywheel. This is an easy method if your bell housing is already attached. So now I can remove this super tight M16 bolt. Using the correct size crankshaft pulley removing tool, it comes off quite easily. Next up are the 10 timing cover bolts. The timing cover can now be removed, exposing the oil pump, camshaft sprocket, timing chain and chain tensioner. I used the markings on the camshaft sprocket to align things to top dead center. Obviously, to allow the rotation, I removed the bolt that I put in the flywheel earlier. Next up is removing the tension on the chain. I pop a thin drill bit in the hole and that keeps the tensioner in place. The camshaft sprocket bolt can now be removed, and I use a second ratchet to prevent it turning the crankshaft. The timing chain can be released off the sprocket and the sprocket can finally be removed. The 4 cam retainer bolts are next. And now we have access to the camshaft. I spin this a few times as fast as I can, which is quite difficult, but this should push up the lifters into their housings. To hopefully catch the lifters in case they do fall, I use these 8mm steel rods. I've applied some white tape marking the length of a camshaft to ensure the rods go into the correct depth. Notice a flat I had to grind on one of the rods to allow it to fit. The old camshaft can now be pulled out. Easy does it. And the new camshaft can now be installed. The camshaft assembly grease I used is by Gibbs and is very sticky stuff. Again, this is a very slow and deliberate process, being very careful not to nick anything. And the actual process of swapping the camshaft itself is very quick. I spin the camshaft a few times just to check it feels okay. And we can pull out those steel rods now. The retaining plate can now go back on. I add a dab of blue Loctite here, and for all bolts that had thread locker applied from factory. In order to replace the stock chain tensioner with a dog bone style dampener, you have to remove the oil pump. And this means removing the oil pickup tube, which has a very inaccessible bolt. So I've removed the oil pan to make this easier. And finally I can remove the single bolt that attaches the pickup tube to the oil pump. The 4 oil pump bolts can be removed. And the oil pump can be released, giving access to the stock chain tensioner bolts. Remove the chain tensioner and replace it with a new dampener. And while I'm this deep in, it feels like now is a good time to upgrade to a new K-Tech C5R timing chain, even though there's nothing really wrong with the stock chain. The stock single bolt cam sprocket is replaced with a 3-bolt version to match the camshaft. With a bit of a fiddle, I managed to align the timing marks with the chain on and attach it to the camshaft. Tighten up the sprocket bolts and also the dampener bolts. And finally, I turn the crank manually 2 full revolutions just to sanity check that the timing marks line up. And that looks perfect. I can now refit the oil pump, paying particular attention that the oil pickup tube O-ring slots in nicely. The 4 oil pump bolts are loosely attached, allowing it some free movement. Now I turn the crank a few full revolutions, allowing the pump to align itself. And then we do final tightening of the bolts. The oil pickup tube that attaches to the pump with a single bolt can now go back on. Now I can tighten the pickup tube mounting bolts, which I'd also previously loosened. The old RTV needs to be removed before the oil pan can be reattached. Some Permatex high temp RTV is used to reseal the oil pan in the critical corners. The oil pan is loosely attached first, and then it is tightened firmly to the bell housing for alignment. Now the oil pan bolts can be tightened up, and final torquing follows a pattern from centre outwards. The timing cover is next to be reattached, but the bolts are left loose so the harmonic balancer can align the seal before it's finally tightened. To reattach the balancer, I decided to make a tool from some grade 10.9 M16 threaded rod. I cut it to the correct length so all the threads in the crankcase would be engaged, and cut a slot in the top so it could be screwed in. Then I slid on a thick aluminium washer, a thrust bearing and a grade 10 nut. This seats the balancer almost all the way home, and then the original bolt is used for the final bit. This is a 3-stage process, beginning with torquing the original bolt to a whopping 240 pounds-foot. Now the balancer is fully seated, the timing cover bolts can be fully tightened. The second stage is to remove the old bolt and install a brand new torque to yield bolt. This is tightened to 37 foot-pounds. And the final stage is to turn that bolt 140 degrees. I picked an arbitrary starting point and used a protractor to measure where I should finish. And that happens to be just about here. Now I can reattach the water pump and the gaskets. And there we have it. I'm considering this phase of the cam swap complete. The final phase is to upgrade the rocker trunnion bearings. I'm going to be using this BTR Premium Trunnion kit. These are the stock rockers that were removed when replacing the springs. The process starts by mounting the bearings in this arbor press and pressing out the old bearings. The body is pushed out, leaving just the bearing cap inside the actual rocker. The old trunnion body and loose bearing needles can be discarded. Now just need to repeat that another 15 times. And what we're left with are these empty rocker housings. And here's the mess of crap that came out of them. Next, we press in a bearing from the kit into one side of each rocker. Rinse and repeat another 15 times. A new trunnion body goes into the housing and slides into the bearing. And a second bearing goes over the top. This is all pressed in using 2 large spacer washers provided in the kit. And you guessed it, another 15 times. And the last stage is to fit the 2 retaining washers on each side and the snap rings to keep them in place. And there's 31 more of those to do. And this is what the rockers with the new Trunnion kit looks like. To refit the rockers, we start by putting the original push rods back in. The rockers are assembled back on their tray, bearing in mind that the intake and exhaust ones are different, and then transferred over to the valve housing. I loosely tighten a few of the bolts just to keep it roughly in place. And now I want to check that the original push rods are still the correct length. This is achieved by tightening the rocker down to 0 lash, and then counting the number of turns it takes to nip up the bolt. If that ends up between half a turn and 1.5 turns, then we're using the correct size push rod. So I've counted 1 3/8 turns. So I'm more than happy that this is still the correct length of push rod. The rockers can now all be bolted down loosely. And all the rockers that aren't putting the springs under compression can be torqued down first, and the remaining ones after the crank's been turned. As my engine's been sitting there for a long period of time without being started, I wanted to re-prime it with oil. I'm using an M16 by 1.5 to a 1/2 inch hose connector that fits into the oil gallery. Connect up some 1/2 inch hose to a cheap drill pump and spin the drill until oil is observed coming out the rockers. I opened the oil drain plug and cycled oil around the system while occasionally turning the crank. It took somewhere between 8 and 10 litres before I observed oil coming out of the rockers. Now happy that I've got oil circulating in the system, I can put the valve covers back on, followed by the coil packs, and finally the spark plugs. I hope you enjoyed this cam swap walkthrough, and in the next video I'm going to be starting her up, so make sure you click on the like and subscribe button.